And let's send it back to Mike in the studio, who I understand has some updated information for you.
That's right, Elaine. We're ready to call another state. New Hampshire ends up in the win column for Barack Obama, the president winning New Hampshire. Of course, Governor Romney has a summer home in New Hampshire, was hoping to take New Hampshire. This is one of those critical states, and it goes in the wrong direction, just like Wisconsin did in this last hour. Let's check in with Sean, who's in Boston. Obviously, that's another blow to the Romney camp. They were hoping to get New Hampshire.
I think hoping is putting it mildly. That was one of the states that was listed as a must-win. If you look at the way Mitt Romney has campaigned over the last week, he has crisscrossed much of the country, touching on a number of those battleground states, made a number of stops in New Hampshire. It only has 4 electoral votes, and it may not seem like that much. But when there's a race that's this tight, this close, those 4 electoral votes could make a huge difference at the end of the night. You also talked about Wisconsin, that's another setback. I want to give you some information that we were able to call from Mitt Romney just a short while ago. In Wisconsin, they'd actually thought they were doing okay. They said they had the numbers they wanted in Madison, and that's significant. The capital, Madison, Wisconsin, that is a very, very liberal state. It's where Wisconsin University is as well. Let's talk about Virginia and Florida for just a couple of seconds. They're very close there as well. In Florida, there are still people in lines. A couple of hours ago, Mitt Romney's communication chief spoke to the crowd assembled here at Romney's camp at the convention center in Boston and said there are huge lines in Florida. There are people that could be in lines, Mike, until midnight. She is telling people, do not get out of those lines. It's going to be very important. And the information they have, they believe that Dade County is actually not doing as well as Barack Obama had wanted. And that's important because that clearly is going to be a Democratic stronghold, the number of Hispanic voters down in that area as well. And in Ohio, Mike, they're also saying the numbers there are closer than the polls look right now. Of course, those numbers right now are very much in Barack Obama's favor. But behind me, this crowd is not diminished in any way. Every time a new result comes on, every time the ebb and flow and the electoral vote comes up, another cheer comes out from this crowd assembled in this red, white, and blue area. Mike, back to you.
All right, Sean, Caleb's live for us in Boston, Massachusetts. Of course, more polls closing out west. We'll get to the numbers a little bit later, but we're going to take a short break. All right, we're ready to make a projection. Of course, Utah, this is not a surprise. It goes for, let me get back out of this here for a second, clear that, and we will predict Utah. It will go for Mitt Romney, and that is not a surprise at all. About 94% of the population there, Mormon. It was expected that he would carry that. All right, let's take a look at some of the numbers on Ohio, too, if we can, because this is kind of interesting. The exit polling. The trends we're seeing there, women are voting for Barack Obama, 55% Hispanics, 56%. He's also getting a large African-American vote this evening. And let's take a look at what's happening with Mitt Romney, the former Massachusetts governor. 43% of the women voting for him and 40% of Hispanics voting for Mitt Romney. Let's check in with Jessica Stone, who's in Chicago at the Obama headquarters. What's the mood like right now?
It still continues to build here in terms of the excitement, but let's talk specifically about Ohio. Ohio is a place where the president visited 13 times since the Democratic National Convention in September. It is his most visited state, and Vice President Joe Biden made a surprise stop at Cleveland, Ohio today, just underscoring the fact that the Obama campaign did not want to let the local news stations in the state of Ohio have one story to tell, that Mitt Romney was there, but they were not. So there is a big dedication to the state of Ohio here. The president always talks about his commitment to the auto industry and his belief that the bailout of the auto industry saved it, that it was a good idea. He contrasts that with Mitt Romney's message that there should have been a private bankruptcy. And keep in mind, of course, as we've heard tonight, 1 in 8 jobs in the state of Ohio are linked to the auto industry. It is a state in which many of the votes cast have something to do with the president's position on that. There was a big commitment by the campaign to the state of Ohio. The president also calling campaign volunteers earlier today from Chicago in the state of Ohio to congratulate them, to thank them for their time and their service. There were over 100 ground offices by the campaign on the ground that were able to deploy volunteers, knocking on those doors, making those phone calls. A real effort by this campaign to get out the vote in Ohio. Ohio, which of course appears to be working for them so far.
All right, Jessica Stone, live for us there in Chicago, Illinois. Let's check back in with Philip Yen.
All right, Mike, thank you. You know, another part of the world that's also closely watching this election as well is Europe. And for good reason, Europe's been keeping an eye on the U.S. election because they're concerned about how the outcome might affect that continent. When we think about the economy, we think about what's happening in Iran and also the winding down of the war in Afghanistan, all these things affect the Europeans. And the two men, President Obama and Governor Romney, both have very different views about the continent. I want to bring into the show now Richard Bestick, our CCTV correspondent, joining us live from London. And Richard, you know, President Obama has a high favorable rating when it comes to the Europeans. And Romney, for lack of a better word, is a bit of a challenge in that department. I'm wondering from the folks that you speak to on the ground there, if you can help answer the reason why.
Well, you're absolutely right, Phil. There are no swing voters anywhere near here. Right across Northern Europe, it's Obama land. If Europeans got the vote, the President of the United States would have no worries about being re-elected. It depends on where you are as to the reasons. Here in Britain, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, had quite a frosty relationship. You'll remember Mitt Romney came to the UK during the Olympics and started talking about how badly organised they were and saying that they were going to end up as a terrible disaster. Well, they didn't, but he managed to upset a lot of people en route through Europe. In France, you won't be surprised to learn that is the most strongly Obama-favoured land in the European Union. That too is not keen on the economics that Mitt Romney has been putting over, much rather having somebody like Obama who has a history of financing the economy in a bid to bring it out of the
Richard,
recession.
I want to ask you,
the Germans.
Richard, you're in the middle of obviously all of the activity there in Europe. You're in the UK, but the rest of the Europe is very split. You have a strong economy in the north and a weak economy in the south. And as we go through the last couple of years with this debt crisis that's looming, is there any thoughts that perhaps which candidate might offer perhaps some additional assistance when it comes to the European crisis?
Well, yes. I mean, certainly the European governments would prefer to have Obama. First of all, it's the devil you know. He is also stimulating the American economy. A stimulated American economy will eventually help the European economy. There is, of course, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is based in Washington. A lot of US tax dollars will be going in there. Mitt Romney might have a very different view on how the IMF should be financing the economic problems of Europe. And so all these reasons come together. Ironically, you would think that Greece, the country that has started off the great collapse of the Eurozone, would be one of those countries most in favour of Obama. It turns out that only 45% of Greeks want Obama. They are more lukewarm than most of the European states.
All right, Richard, great to have you on board. Thank you very much. At this time, I'll send it back to Mike. And Mike, you heard it there. If the Europeans had a vote, apparently they'd vote for Obama.
All right, well, we're finding out how the folks in Ohio are voting, the Buckeye State right now. President Obama still holding a slim lead, 4 percentage points, 51% to 47%. This one too early to call, but Alan Lichtman feels pretty confident that this is. Let's take a look at the state as
I'm
it flies in.
calling Ohio for Obama, as I did a long time ago.
Let's just hold off for just a second until we get confirmation of that. But this is 18
That's
electoral
my personal
votes.
call.
It is a very important state for Mitt Romney, especially since he lost New Hampshire and Wisconsin. Is there any other path for victory? Do you
Zero path for victory without Ohio. He's lost Wisconsin. He's lost Michigan. He's lost Pennsylvania. You lose Ohio, it's ball game. And I am, as I said before, 99% confident that Obama is going to win Ohio, regardless of what those cautious folks in the networks might have to say. You heard it here first.
We're going to show some caution as well. We're saying it's too early to call. Let's take a look at Virginia. This one also too early to call, but right now, shifting in the direction of President Obama, 51% to 47%. And you say that this one really is a squeaker.
Yes,
we'll take
I
a look
can't
at it
call
as
that
well.
one.
Let's watch the fly-in on Virginia too, if we can, because this one is an interesting state in that, you know, it does have this tendency to kind of mostly go Republican, but last time around, Obama was able to win here.
You know what's happening in Virginia is the same thing that's happening all over America. The demographics are changing. Latinos are a much bigger percentage of the Virginia population than they were a decade or 20 years ago. African Americans are voting in bigger numbers, and that's made it a more competitive state than ever before. That's why Obama could win it last time and why he's competitive there this time.
And really the spot to watch is the northern part of the state. This is close to Washington, D.C., Fairfax and Arlington counties, not to get too far into the weeds, but those tend to go more Democratic, whereas Loudoun County and perhaps Prince William, they could go either way, right?
That's right. Obama needs big wins in what we call the Virginia, D.C. suburbs, the northern counties bordering the District of Columbia, the capital, which have lots and lots of voters. Those counties have boomed in recent years. Another reason why you've got to count Virginia now as what we call a purple state, somewhere between red and blue.
I live in Northern Virginia. It took me over an hour to vote at a time when people normally aren't in the lines. I heard at 7 o'clock when the polling places, that's when you end voting. And yet if you're in line, you can still vote. And there were long, long lines in a lot of these counties that we're talking about.
And that's always good news for Democrats when there's high turnout. Republicans do better when there's lower turnout, simply given the different demographics of their bases of support.
All right, Alan Lichtman's going to be here with us all evening long. Let's take a look at how the U.S. government actually works, because there's much more than the president involved here.
Under the U.S. Constitution, the power of the government is shared among three branches: the executive, led by the president; legislative, comprised of the two houses of Congress; and the judicial branch, led by the Supreme Court. The president is the leader of the executive branch of the government and the head of the armed forces. He leads its administration in performing day-to-day executive functions of the federal government, nominates the justices who sit on the Supreme Court, and has the power to reject bills passed by Congress. The Congress functions as the only federal lawmaking body. With representatives from 50 U.S. states, the Congress is granted significant power by the Constitution. The bills rejected by the president can be subsequently passed again if approved by 2/3 of the entire Congress. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the U.S., with ultimate power to decide cases and review laws based on their interpretation of the Constitution. The president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court together guard the U.S. Constitution.
And Nina Donahue joins us live from Capitol Hill, where a lot of eyes are on these elections involving Congress.
That's right. Well, the focus here is actually on the several Senate races that are coming out. Some of them are too close to call quite yet. Virginia, Montana, too close to call. But we have some results, and the Democrats are holding on to their still quite slim majority. We've had results from Massachusetts. Elizabeth Warren has taken the Republican seat from Scott Brown. Also Democratic wins for Florida, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Missouri. We've also heard that Joe Donnelly is very much in the lead in Indiana. There was obviously a controversy involving his opponent there, which I'll explain in my piece coming up. There's been a lot of drama in these Senate races, just as much as there has been at the White House. So let's take a look at the drama that's been unfolding this past year.
America has been focused on the White House, but it's control of the United States Senate that's key to power in the U.S. legislative system. Without power over that 100-member forum, whoever is president will struggle to pass legislation. In this campaign year, the presidential race was the main feature, but key Senate races across the country have provided just as much political drama. One closely fought battle was in Massachusetts. For 2 years, the traditionally Democratic state has been steered by a Republican, Senator Scott Brown, the handsome favorite of the conservative Tea Party movement. His polls-apart challenger, Elizabeth Warren, a high-profile liberal consumer advocate. They've come to blows in a series of nationally televised debates.
Excuse me, we're not. Go ahead. Excuse me, I'm not a student in your classroom. Please let me respond, okay? Thank you.
In the northeastern state of Maine, the resignation of the moderate Republican, 18-year veteran Senator Olympia Snowe, came as a shock and left a political vacuum. In swing state Virginia, two former governors attempted a comeback.
Democrat Tim Kaine and Republican George Allen. Allen hoping voters have forgotten a racist comment to one of exiting Senator Jim Webb's staffers.
Let's give a welcome to Makaka here.
And a more recent political blunder in Indiana, putting Republican Richard Murdoch in the media spotlight for all the wrong reasons.
And I think even when life begins in that horrible situation of rape, that it is something that God intended to happen.
Condemned by his rival Joe Donnelly and his party.
I would agree with Governor Romney to disavow those remarks.
And in Missouri, Republican contender Todd Akin's similar comments on rape brought the Senate's dramas right back to the White House.
I don't think that they would agree with the senator from Missouri in terms of his statement, which was way out there.
Well, as we saw, Joe Donnelly just announced as the winner in Indiana, beating Richard Murdoch there, partly maybe because of that controversy. We also have, we're expecting more results, of course, from more Republican-friendly states coming up across the country. The drama isn't over yet. It really looks like at this stage that the Democrats might hold on to their slim majority, but the real high drama could happen is if there's some kind of 50-50 split, and that would mean whoever eventually wins the presidency later this evening would have to split the difference. That's the vice president's role.
Should be interesting. Nina Donahue with an update there on Capitol Hill. Certainly appreciate it. Let's take a look at Montana, where Mitt Romney has scored another victory. This gives him 3 more electoral votes, 56% of the vote coming in there in favor of Mitt Romney. So we'll take a look at the map now, and we'll go up here, and we will give 3 to Mitt Romney. And as you can see, the tally right now, 163 for Mitt Romney, 163 for the president as well. Philip Yen's been following the business and financial aspect of this evening, and he's going to join us again now.
Yeah, hi, Mike. You know, this money in politics between the campaign contributions and what's raised, what's not raised, it's very fascinating, not just to viewers obviously here in the United States, but to viewers around the world, and the amount of money that is spent on getting one person reelected, whether it's president or the United States Senate. Michelle McCory takes a look out of New York City as to just how big this really is.
Phil, the issue having such an impact on this campaign isn't what Obama spent the first time he ran for president, a record $750 million. It's what other groups spent. Campaign managers call these groups outside sources. Now, under the restrictions in effect in 2008, outside sources spent around $286 million US. After Obama opted out of the public finance system that would have capped his spending that year, an outside group called Citizens United filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Federal Election Commission and its spending restrictions. In 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Citizens United, and this unleashed a spending tsunami. The court decision created super PACs, outside sources like corporations and labor unions that can spend any amount of money they wish to in order to influence an election, as long as that money doesn't go directly to a candidate. Now, these outside spenders also include so-called 501c groups that don't have to disclose their donors. In the closing days of this campaign, the amount of outside spending skyrocketed. The combined overall spending in this campaign, and that includes the money spent by the Republican and Democratic Party national committees, is around $2 billion. Each candidate has spent around $1 billion. Now, to put that number in perspective, $2 billion is more than 40 times the combined spending of all 4,150 candidates who ran for a seat in Britain's parliament in 2010. Now, Will Rogers, one of America's most beloved political humorists in the 20th century, said, "Politics has become so expensive that it takes a lot of money to be defeated." In the 2012 spending race, either Barack Obama or Mitt Romney is about to become the biggest loser in the history of American politics.
All right, thank you. We're now going to talk a little bit more about this. We're joined by Kathy Kiley, Managing Director of the Sunlight Foundation, very big journalist organization covering campaign contributions. And we also welcome back Stephen Roach from Yale University. Both of you, thank you. And I think it's something we can agree on, that the amount of money that's spent on campaigns, whether it's for the president or for the Senate races, is really amazing, not just to Americans, but to people around the world. And Michelle mentioned something about outside campaign contributions. Perhaps you can help us explain what exactly that means, Kathy.
Well, one of the things about this race is that this is a race where all the candidates are talking about what a bad economy it is, but people are spending billions of dollars literally to win elections this year in a bad economy. So it's a bad economy for everybody but political consultants. Now, one of the reasons the spending has gone up so much is the outside groups who were able to spend more money and write bigger checks than ever before. And by outside spending, what we're talking about are groups that are not the candidates' committees. There are some political committees that the parties spin off, but mostly these are organizations, super PACs, we're calling them large political action committees, and some of them are organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, like the National Rifle Association.
Are there any limits to this? Because this has been a point of contention.
No
It's
limits
unlimited.
at all. Unlimited spending. That's what outside money can do.
Where can the money be from? It can be from the United States. Can it be from Europe?
No. It can't be. It cannot be from foreign interests. However, because the money is coming in, some of these committees do not have to report their donors. No one really can be sure.
But Phil, this is really, you use the word amazing. I would use the word obscene. In a country like ours, which is starved to spend on infrastructure, where the per capita incomes are stagnating, where we have unemployment at double-digit rates if you measure the numbers correctly, to spend $6 billion on over 1 million ads to elect a president.
By the way, waste of money. Most of those ads are negative. The outside interest groups, it's running 3 to 1, more than 3 to 1 negative ads.
I mean, that's an example of the Supreme Court really corrupting the value proposition of this country.
Now, some might argue that $6 billion spent in federal campaigns across this country, a lot of it trickles to television stations, for example. It trickles to radio stations. It trickles to campaign organizers. It trickles to consultants, as you will. Is it that necessarily negative for the economy to spend so much on an election?
Whenever I hear the word trickle, what little hair is left on my head starts to stand up. You guys are trying to stretch something bad into something good. And I'd much rather see the money be spent directly to a cause that is needy. And we have plenty of them in this country other than going to the political infrastructure of the United States.
Kathy, help us explain to our viewers super PAC, because we throw that word around a lot. What does super PAC mean, and can anybody be a super PAC?
Yes, anybody can be a super PAC, as the comedian Stephen Colbert proved earlier this year when he formed his own super PAC. Basically, what a super PAC is a committee that can take in money in unlimited amounts and spend it in unlimited amounts with one proviso. They cannot coordinate their spending with the candidate that they are trying to help.
So essentially what happens is the three of us could form a super PAC. We could put in a certain amount of money, and then we could spend it on ads either for something or against someone.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
But I've seen the analysis of this. I mean, every super PAC says they're unaffiliated, but they are affiliated, and you can identify exactly if they're red or blue or.
It sounds like we're in agreement that it's an as you say, obscene amount of money that's being taken. Now, there has been people who've talked about more reform, more regulation about how the elections are run. Has that gained any traction in the last couple of years?
Zero. This is like the arms race. Everybody says it should end, but nobody wants to take the first step because they're afraid the other guy won't follow suit. So right now, I don't see that there's any opportunity. There are groups, including the Sunlight Foundation, which are trying to convince lawmakers to try to lay down their arms, but so far, no dice.
But Kathy, weren't we going in the right direction until the Citizens United decision came? I mean, wasn't campaign finance reform getting traction, and then all of a sudden the Supreme Court really took us on a 180 here?
Well, I think one of the ironies about campaign reform is that you have many people saying that they want to do this in one form or fashion. The Supreme Court, you're right, did blow a big hole in the most recent legislation. But what is really aggravating to me is that we have the technology now to make campaign contributions absolutely transparent and immediate. We have technology that could tell you if I give you the money, it would be up online the next day. Nobody wants to use it.
It is an amazing, and I talk to viewers from around the world, and they're always amazed by the amount of money that's spent. Both of you, thank you very much for your contributions to this interesting topic. I'm going to send it over to Elaine Reyes, right next to the White House.
All right, thanks a lot, Philip. We continue our special team coverage around the globe. Let's check in with Adel Al-Marouki, who is joining us live from Cairo. And Adel, you know, Egypt has a new president. Can you tell us how Egyptians are looking at this U.S. presidential election?
Well, there are no major expectations here in Egypt from the U.S. presidential elections. In 4 years, basically, Obama did not change much, nor in Egypt or in the Middle East. And many expect that more of the same would happen within the next 4. But many also fear that if Romney wins and enters the White House, there will be more interference here in the region, which would escalate tension.
The U.S. elections is not a topic greatly debated here in Egypt. In general, Egyptians are quite indifferent about the results. The ruling Freedom and Justice Party and the government take a diplomatic and balanced view.
We are respecting the choice, the outcome of the results, the choice of the people, as we are calling here for a democracy, and there is no significant difference between the Republican and the Democrats. We are, as I mentioned, with the choice of the people. We see that whoever the next president for the United States, he will implement the general policy for the United States.
This doesn't mean that Egyptians don't have a favorite candidate.
Egyptians in general are more compassionate with Obama rather than Romney. This is mainly because of his Islamic roots and native attachment to the African continent.
Obama's roots are one thing, but candidate Romney's seemingly hawkish statements on Middle East issues have caused alarm among many Egyptians.
I like Obama more. I hope he wins. Romney? I'm afraid he'll turn our region to a war zone like George W. Bush. But Obama wants to get the American troops out.
Mitt Romney using the cowboy policy or cowboy diplomacy. Barack Obama is trying to have a more balanced relation.
This is basically the sense in the Egyptian street, particularly when it comes to aid to Egypt. There's a sense that the Democrats are supporting the continuance of aid to Egypt, while on the other hand, when it comes to Republicans, they have been questioning the benefits from such an aid. And this is what Egyptians feel, that if Obama continues, so will the aid. On the other hand, Romney is also a sort of an alert to not only Egypt, but when we talk to people in Sudan, some of the Syrian citizens here in Egypt, and from Libya as well, they're all preferable for a second-term U.S. president, believing that he will have less influence from the Jewish and what they call Zionist lobbies in the United States, and so they believe this will be more pro the peace process here in Egypt, and maybe the next term for Obama could establish a Palestinian state. Elaine.
Okay, Adel Al-Marouki, thank you so much, reporting live from Cairo. Of course, we'll continue to check in with our CCTV correspondents around the globe, but let's send it back to our Washington studio with my colleague Anand Naidu.
Thanks, Elaine, and we're going to be talking now to Laura Carlson and Doug Paul again, and this time on the Middle East. I mean, there was a big focus during that debate, the third debate between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney on the Middle East, focusing on Iran, focusing on Israel. No matter who comes back or gets into the White House after this election, are we going to see another attempt to resolve the Middle East conflict? This seems to be a perennial thing. You know, every president tries it, but then decides to kick the can down the road.
In general, presidents in their second terms, if it's Mr. Obama who's reelected, there's a chance he will turn his attention to the Arab-Israeli dispute. It hasn't gone well for him in the first term, and he decided to back off from it because he didn't think he had a partner to work with in Israel, and that there was too much dissent within the Palestinian movement. In the case of Romney, he's so totally identified with the Israeli government and the personal friendship with Benjamin Netanyahu that I think most people in the region would think there's very little prospect for moving peace forward. Now, there might be a Nixon to China kind of phenomenon, but that's not in the cards right now.
Well, as you point out, you know, the Israeli right wants to see President Romney. Why is that? What is he going to do for them?
Well, he thinks it'll back them up as they continue to expand the settlements into the West Bank and to resist efforts to have a real compromise. That's kind of fighting against the tides of history. Israel is becoming an increasingly Arab country as population trends continue. And Israel's going to have to face that someday, but I think the Israeli right thinks they can have 4 to 8 years under Romney to protect themselves.
Okay. Laura, one of the issues that both candidates agreed on largely was the issue of Iran and its nuclear program. Let's take a look at the exchange that they had in that third debate on foreign affairs. Let's watch.
As long as I'm President of the United States, Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. I made that clear when I came into office. We then organized the strongest coalition and the strongest sanctions against Iran in history, and it is crippling their economy. Their currency has dropped 80%. Their oil production has plunged to the lowest level since they were fighting a war with Iraq 20 years ago. So their economy is in a shambles.
I'd make sure that Ahmadinejad is indicted under the Genocide Convention. His words amount to genocide incitation. I would indict him for it. And of course, a military action is the last resort. It is something one would only consider if all of the other avenues had been tried to their full extent.
So, Laura, here we have these two candidates who largely agreed with each other, trying to outdo each other on how serious they would get on Iran. Is that going to change at all?
In some ways they were, but on the other hand, you saw Romney backing down a little bit because he seems to be a little afraid about being the war candidate. So he said he'd stick with sanctions and avoid military intervention. It's hard to say what would really happen if he was in the presidency. And I think the president has been frustrated lately, but would like to continue on the road to sanctions, and we can expect that. And there's even some possibility people are talking about that after a re-election, there could be more negotiations there.
Will it ever come to military involvement, do you think?
Well, I think everybody wants to avoid that because it's a tinderbox, obviously, in the entire region. And although there are advisors among the neocons and some of the ultra-right in the Romney camp that would like to show more muscle there, I think everyone really does not want to have to come to that point.
Doug, another country, close ally of the United States at one time under President Mubarak, and that's Egypt. But they've had a democratic election, and now they have someone who is more closely aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood, something that the United States has made clear it is not happy with. In fact, Barack Obama went as far as to say Egypt is no longer our ally. What happens in the new term?
Well, the Obama administration has a lot of regrouping to do on Middle East policy. They've been responding to events, trying to get ahead of them, but always behind the curve. And the time ahead is going to be one where they need to sort of get some order into what the priorities are. We're supporting established autocracies in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. We don't want to see change there because we depend on their strong support. But we wanted to promote change in other countries in the North African states. And it's a mixed message. It doesn't send a clear signal.
Okay, much more to talk about later, but for now, let's send it back to Mike.
All right, we're just getting 58% of the precincts now in for Ohio, and Obama still leading there slightly, 50 to 48%. We're also finding a similar number in Florida. These are two of the key battleground states, 50% to 49% in favor of Barack Obama. Lots more just ahead.
Let's march on these ballot boxes.
It's a U.S. election.
Romney, Romney, Romney.
With an impact felt around the world.
I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi.
In the next half hour, we're going to Africa.
The continent is home to 6 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies.
Debating the U.S. military's move to Asia.
We spend more on our military than the next 10 countries combined.
And much more. CCTV's coverage of the 2012 U.S. presidential election continues right now. Welcome back, everybody. Of course, all eyes on Ohio right now. And again, this one we're saying is too early to call. Barack Obama, the President of the United States, still with a slight lead there, 50% to 48%. But this one's still very, very close. And Craig Morrow is in Cincinnati, Ohio with the latest update.
Hi, Mike. We're waiting here to see what exactly happens across Ohio. Now, there's still a lot of ballots and precincts to be counted in a lot of the big counties, which include the big urban areas. I can tell you about what's happening here Where I am is called Hamilton County. Cincinnati is a relatively large city in this county, but this is a fairly diverse county. You have rural conservative areas in the north. You have conservative-leaning suburbs ringing the city, and then a more liberal, Democratic-leaning city in that of Cincinnati. And this county is considered a kind of a swing county, even though it tends to go Republican. A lot of attention has been put here because it's believed President Barack Obama especially needs to do well here. He won this county in 2008, even though it is traditionally Republican-leaning, and that helped him carry the state then. Obama, there is about a little under a fifth of the precincts here in Hamilton County reporting so far, and Obama has a comfortable lead, but there's still about 400 more precincts to be reported, and that's the same situation in other counties throughout this state.
All right, Craig Morrow reporting from Cincinnati, Ohio. We'll be checking in with him throughout the evening because that obviously is a key state. Let's take a look at Arizona right now. Mitt Romney has won the state of Arizona. Of course, it was carried by John McCain as well 4 years ago, and Mitt Romney, a decisive win there with 56% of the vote, 42% for President Barack Obama. Let's check in with Jessica Stone, who is in Chicago, Illinois, with an update from the Obama headquarters.
Well, we have gotten a couple of tidbits, if you will, from the president's chief strategist, David Axelrod, talking about Florida and Virginia. On Twitter, he talked about Florida in particular, that when we have a race this close, he said, there are two counties that we're waiting to hear from, and these are the same two counties that figured very heavily in President Bush's win in 2000, where the race was so close. He also talked about Virginia. The campaign appears very confident that Virginia is going exactly as planned. You know, going into this election night, David Axelrod, who has a very prominent mustache, had made the joke that if the president lost Minnesota, Wisconsin, or Pennsylvania, he would shave the mustache off of his face, which he had had for 40 years. And apparently he will not have to do that tonight because the president handily wins Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And we also know that Iowa and Nevada are leading his way. We're already hearing some cheers behind me. The room is filling up. What you can't see behind me, you can kind of see how the room is filling up behind me, but what you can't see is that all the way over there, there is a mass of people, and over to my side here, there are risers full of people, campaign volunteers, campaign surrogates, supporters from all over the country piling in as we get closer and closer to hopefully hearing from the president tonight.
And Jessica, the West Coast, those polls close a lot later. We've already talked to our audience about how they close at different times throughout the night. The West Coast expected to be very much in Barack Obama's corner, and California, such a rich state, 55 electoral votes, that can really help the president this evening, right?
Sure thing, and it's a state he carried in 2008 quite handily, a state where the Asian American vote figures in quite heavily. This campaign made a special effort, especially in Nevada, I think that's where we'll most see it, where the Asian American vote will make a big difference in how the president does. This was a concerted effort by the campaign that began 4 years ago, and they've been building through Asian American surrogates in this country, offering literature in all kinds of Asian languages, ranging from Vietnamese to Korean and Chinese, approaching people in their native tongues, talking about the issues in this election, both foreign policy and economic, in their native tongues, giving them voting materials in their native tongues, and we even know that ballots were printed in the state of Washington, for example, in Chinese. So there was a concerted effort by this campaign to get out that particular vote in the western states like Nevada and California.
All right, Jessica Stone live for us in Chicago, Illinois. That is the Obama headquarters. And let's take a look at the map now, and we want to show that Mitt Romney has captured the state of Arizona. And right now, as you can see, the electoral votes 174 to 163. What's interesting is, you know, they say home is where the heart is. Well, Mitt Romney has a vacation home there in New Hampshire. His home state is Massachusetts. Of course, he was born in Michigan. All of those states going blue tonight. The last presidential candidate to lose his home state and his birth state was James Polk. He was the 11th president of the United States. That was back in 1840. So does not look so good for Mitt Romney this evening. Let's go over to Anand.
Thanks, Mike. I wasn't around that time as well. Well, with me now in the studio, I have Sabrina Schaefer. She is a Republican strategist, and Richard Fowler, who's a Democratic strategist. Sabrina, ladies first. What do you make of the race so far?
Well, the number one thing I'm taking away from tonight is that the Democrats' get out the vote efforts really are as good as people say they are. I think that that's what we're going to find, that even with high unemployment, even with a debt that has soared over $16 trillion, even though the president's signature domestic policy issue, Obamacare, is wildly unpopular, the country appears to be still supporting him. And it's not over yet, but that's what I'm beginning to take away from this evening.
Okay, Richard?
Well, I think she's right. Sabrina's right on some of these points, but at the same time, I think the other thing that we're beginning to see is that the places where Mitt Romney campaigned the most, he's losing those places, like in Ohio, the counties that he hit the most, he's losing them, meaning that all along we've talked about Romney having this identity crisis, and the polls are starting to reflect that. I think one interesting poll people can pay attention to at home that reflects that is what's happening in the state of Virginia. In Virginia, Allen is up, and Obama is up at the same time, meaning that people identify more with Allen than they do with Mitt Romney. And I think that's real telling for the governor of Massachusetts. I think he has a long way to haul to win this election. I won't call it for the president yet, but I think looking at the numbers, looking at what's happening in some key counties, key counties around the country, we'll see.
Well, interesting point you raised there. I mean, the fact that the vote in Virginia has been split.
It has, and I think that everyone was hoping that this is a state that, it will continue to be in play, and obviously Republicans and Democrats are both still fighting for it, and we have those outside of the Beltway counties that we're looking for, but we'll have to see. We still have Florida to consider, and Colorado and Wisconsin, so there are still states in play. This election is not yet over.
And I guess the point we should make is that these are three equal branches in government, the White House on the one hand, and we have the Hill, which is, where Congress sits, and we have the Supreme Court as well. We have a piece of video of Mitt Romney, who was on the plane earlier on talking to journalists. Let's take a look at that.
Intellectually, I felt that we're going to win this, and I felt that for some time. But emotionally, just getting off the plane and seeing those people standing there, we didn't tell them we were coming. We didn't notify them when we'd arrived. Just seeing people there cheering as they were, connected emotionally with me. And I not only think we're going to win intellectually, but I feel it as well.
Confidence a little bit misplaced?
Well, I don't know if it was misplaced. Let's just remember that this weekend I actually was in Ohio, and Governor Romney was attracting crowds of 30,000 people. Similarly, or I should say dissimilarly, the president had to bring out over 40 celebrities to get much, much, much smaller crowds. So I think all of this, there is a lot of enthusiasm. There is a big desire for a change in the direction of this country. And we're still going to have to see how, if Governor Romney is able to squeak it out in some of these key states like Ohio.
And I think the distinction here, Sabrina, and I disagree with you here, is because I think what we saw from the president's camp was they weren't planning on doing any rallies today at all, because they understood that they wanted to focus on their ground operation. When you take folks, and anybody at home gets this, if you move staff to man a rally or man an event, you take staffs away from the field. So Romney had 2 events today in which he had to take staff off the field to man an event. And at the same time, Obama's staff they were talking to voters, they were knocking on doors, they were making sure that their voters were turning out. And I think that's what's going to be critical tonight going into the next couple of hours, where you see the turnout happen. What happens in places like Cleveland, Ohio? What happens like places in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Miami, Florida, Richmond, Virginia?
Okay, Richard, Sabrina, we're going to have to leave it there for now, but I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more, because there's a lot more to happen in this election as the hours unfold tonight. But for now, let's send it back to Elaine.
All right, thank you so much, Anand. President Barack Obama's father, Barack Obama Sr., was born in Kenya, and the president has 5 half-brothers and a half-sister still living there. CCTV correspondent Beatrice Marshall is with us now from Nairobi to tell us how the U.S. election is playing out in Africa.
Well, reaction to the U.S. election in Africa this year has been rather muted compared to the euphoria that greeted the 2008 U.S. election. Now, 4 years ago, Africa watched very keenly and celebrated across the continent when Barack Obama was elected U.S. president, and his ancestral home of Kenya declared a public holiday. Now, today, critics argue that President Obama's global health and global climate initiatives have little concrete to show, and Obama's absence on the continent has been a distinct pointer. Obama only visited the region once. Well, one of the biggest challenges for U.S.-Africa policy today as well in the last 4 years has been the rise of China on the continent. China is today Africa's largest trading partner, and many countries are embracing a deliberate look-east policy because of the economic potential. In the meantime, the U.S. remains an influential force on the continent, but it is no longer the dominating influence.
All right, well, what issues will the next president of the United States be facing in the African region over the next 4 years?
Well, Elaine, there is a lot of comparison in Africa today on the U.S. versus China policy approach. The Obama approach has not been well received by African leaders, especially compared with what is on offer from China. Beijing has invested heavily in areas of roads, power and business projects in nearly every African country. An incoming U.S. president would need to take this fact into consideration. Today, the continent is home to 6 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies. And African countries are successfully combining liberal politics with market economics to become the next target for frontier investors. And today as well, Africa does not want charity, but is seeking investment, particularly with its new status as an oil and gas producing continent. Back to you.
All right, Beatrice Marshall reporting from Nairobi, Kenya. Time to send it back to our Washington studio with Anand Naidu.
Thanks, Elaine. Now, during its 4 years in office, the Obama administration has reevaluated its military priorities around the world. The U.S., of course, ended the war in Iraq and announced a full drawdown of its forces from Afghanistan by the end of 2014. Now the focus is shifting to the Asia-Pacific region, and the Pentagon has already started moving many of its forces to that part of the world. Let's take a closer look at how the U.S. is redefining its role in the world. The United States Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta outlined America's new emphasis, popularly known as the Asia Pivot, in June of this year during an address in Singapore. He told the so-called Shangri-La Dialogue Conference that by 2020, the Pentagon plans to move most of its naval fleet to the Pacific. If some view that as a direct challenge to China, Panetta was quick to dispel such perceptions.
Our effort to renew and intensify our involvement in Asia is fully compatible with the development and growth of China.
Some of the changes began even before Panetta's speech. In April of this year, the United States and Japan announced an agreement to move 9,000 Marines from the Japanese island of Okinawa to Guam and other Asia-Pacific sites. The United States calls its strategy a rebalancing. Up to now, the U.S. Navy has split its forces roughly 50-50 between the Atlantic and the Pacific. But under the new focus, that will change to 60-40, with more attention being paid to Asia. It will include moving 6 aircraft carriers into the region and a majority of the Navy's cruisers, destroyers, combat ships and submarines. Now it comes as China is appointing a new generation of military leaders. Beijing announced only 2 weeks ago that it was reshuffling its top brass, appointing commanders who will concentrate on modernizing its forces. To that end, the Chinese military is starting to field a new class of weapons, including an aircraft carrier, to protect its territorial interests in the Yellow Sea and the East and South China Seas. Well, joining us now is our correspondent, Tony Cheng. He joins us from Bangkok. Tony, we heard there about this refocus by the United States, sending many of its naval assets to the Pacific Ocean. It used to split it 50-50 between the Pacific and the Atlantic. Now it's about 60-40 with most of those assets going to the Pacific. How are Asian nations responding to this? And I think particularly of China, but also other nations like the Philippines and Vietnam. There have been tensions between these countries with China recently over territorial claims in some of the seas down there.
I think it was very interesting. It was very noticeable when the Obama administration first came to power that many of those Southeast Asian nations were keen that America re-engaged. And we saw Hillary Clinton come out here very early on in that administration to try and start that process of re-engagement. Again, many people here in Southeast Asia, I think, felt that the Bush administration had ignored their Asian policy. So they were keen to re-engage with the United States. But as you mentioned, their tensions have ratcheted up, and I think there are increasing concerns that perhaps the United States may be playing a slightly dangerous game here, getting involved in territorial issues that perhaps they really can't control. And I think many nations here in Southeast Asia are interested in seeing a counterbalance to the rise of China, but they also realize that China is the major regional player, and they don't want to upset that too much. So it's going to be, I think they'll be keen to see the Obama administration get back into power and for that process to continue. But they'll also urge caution. I think they want to advance slowly and see how the next 4 years develop, because there are regional tensions here. Nonetheless, this Southeast Asia is also home to some key American allies, Thailand, of course, the Philippines you just mentioned, and Indonesia to a certain extent, which has a personal link to President Barack Obama.
Well, Tony, you know, one of the other things I mentioned there in my report was the reshuffling of the top brass in the Chinese military. I mean, you now have a man who is an admiral who is taking over as the chief of general staff of the Chinese army. I mean, what do you make of that, the fact that a naval man is taking over?
I think it'll be significant. I think those tensions we've talked about in Southeast Asia with China are significant. They have come to a head somewhat in the last 12 months, particularly with the Philippines. But I think people here have backed off. Again, they recognize that China is the rising power in this region and will be for some time. I think they're keen to see the United States engage with Southeast Asia, particularly with the Philippines and Vietnam. But they're also concerned they don't want this situation to escalate anymore. And I think they feel at this stage that they can deal with China. They're keen to see some kind of counterweight there. But I think, again, the United States will advance slowly in this area. It's feeling its way back into Asia, and I think the United States also realizes for economic reasons it has to keep this relationship with Southeast Asia, and particularly with China, one which is mutually beneficial to both sides.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Tony Cheng, our correspondent, talking to us from Bangkok. Now let's go to Victor Gao. He is the director at the China National Association of International Studies and joins us from Beijing. Victor, what do you make of this Asian pivot, as the United States calls it? You know, this redeployment of its naval forces in the Pacific. I mean, is this a provocative act by the United States?
Well, first of all, ever since the end of the Second World War, the United States has never left Asia. Therefore, to call itself re-entry into the Asian-Pacific region is a misnomer to start with. Now, having said that, I think the United States has demonstrated signs of an attempt to contain the peaceful rise of China, and this is a very dangerous situation. And I think from the Chinese perspective, China need to look at this development with full alert, because this part of the world has been more or less peaceful without major confrontation or war. Now, the United States should become a force for peace and stability rather than eventually become a destructive force which will destabilize this part of the world.
Well, you know, President Obama talked about this Asian pivot during the election campaigns. Let's take a listen to what he said.
And when it comes to our military and Chinese security, part of the reason that we were able to pivot to the Asia-Pacific region after having ended the war in Iraq and transitioning out of Afghanistan is precisely because this is going to be a massive growth area in the future. And we believe China can be a partner, but we're also sending a very clear signal that America is a Pacific power, that we are going to have a presence there. We are working with countries in the region to make sure, for example, that ships can pass through, that commerce continues. And we're organizing trade relations with countries other than China so that China starts feeling more pressure about meeting basic international standards.
So, Victor, is there a contradiction in what the president is saying, though? On the one hand, he's saying, well, China can be a partner, yet at the same time, they're deploying military assets very close to China. And we also heard Leon Panetta, who's the defense secretary, talk about the United States fulfilling what he called its military commitments in the region.
Well, first of all, ever since China started to reform and open to the outside world 32 years ago, this part of the world, I mean Southeast Asia, Northeastern Asian, have been peaceful and stable. There's been no interruption of maritime security. There's been no disruption of shipping lane. Trade and businesses are booming. This is probably one of the very few areas where which has not suffered major disruption. Therefore, the United States should be aware of this and should avoid doing anything which eventually, whatever they call it, pivoting or otherwise, may eventually disrupt the peace and stability that we people in this part of the world have been enjoying for more than 3 decades.
Okay, thanks, Victor. Well, let me turn now to our panel in the studio here, and we have with us Laura Carlson and Doug Paul. Doug, let me start with you this time. What do you make of this pivot to Asia by the Obama administration? Why the focus on Asia?
Well, American trade and investment is increasingly shifting to the Asia-Pacific region, and we've been slow to recognize that. But I think there's a lot of misuse of the word pivot. Even if President Obama gets it wrong. It's not a pivot from someplace to someplace. As my good friend Victor Gao said, they're trying to sustain America's presence in the region, protect its existing equities in trade, investment, alliances, and the like. We're not seeing an upswing or an increase in American deployments. The U.S. American defense budget is going down, and it's going to go down very severely in Southwest Asia and elsewhere. And what the president has articulated was a policy of maintaining a floor on those decreases in the Asia-Pacific region.
But I'm wondering, China wants to, it says, prevent the United States from having free passage among what it calls the island chain. I mean, that's part of Chinese military doctrine. This is a group of islands that stretches from the Aleutians all the way south to Borneo. That's the Chinese view.
I have to disagree again. I don't think that is China's view. The idea of area denial is a Western concept that's been projected onto China. Now, China is developing capabilities that if it wants to prevent shipping through that part of the world or the passage of American ships, it might do it, but the cost would be very high, not to the U.S. alone, but to China as well.
Laura, when we look at the United States deployment of its military assets throughout the world, why we hear on the one hand, the administration here in Washington tell us, well, it's wars or differences are no longer going to be resolved by big wars, by armies marching and fighting against each other. It's now very, kind of clinical strikes and surgical strikes against targets, and they're mainly terrorist targets they're talking about. But we're hearing different when it comes to China.
Yeah, I think the danger when you talk about a pivot is that it is being interpreted in some senses as a military pivot, as leaving to a certain degree the Middle East. And you do have some increases in this region, in Australia in particular, and this huge $5.8 billion arms package to Taiwan. And so this could be seen as threatening, and it's going to be very important that it's handled with great care in the future so as not to provoke responses or defensive responses from nations in the area.
Okay, thanks to both of you. Thanks, Doug. And Laura, let's send it to Phil.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to take a look at how Asian Americans have voted over the past couple of election cycles, and there's some interesting statistics to show you. We're going to start with our first graphic right now. The number of Asian Americans voting Democratic has doubled since 1992, and since then, of course, more has been voting Democratic, while those voting for Republicans have fallen. Now, for voter preference, Asian Americans overwhelmingly favor President Obama over Mitt Romney, and more Asian Americans consider themselves, when you ask them how do you identify, which party do you identify with, they identify themselves as Democrats. But here's what's really a bit interesting is the majority of Asian Americans, 51% in fact, consider themselves actually independent. Now, in total, there are 18.2 million Asian Americans here in the United States. They are the largest groups of Asians, when you break them down, include Chinese, Filipino, Indian, and also Vietnamese. And while Asian Americans make up a little over 5% of the U.S. population, there are some underrepresented ones, especially at the highest level of the U.S. government. There is only one Chinese American, by the way, in the United States Congress, and there have been 2 in the United States Senate. Both were from Hawaii. Emily Drew takes a look at one Chinese American leader looking to engage more Asian Americans in government.
Self-promotion and being able to market yourself are things that Asian Americans don't generally like to do.
Christopher Chan says cultural differences keep many Asian Americans out of U.S. politics.
I think we're very underrepresented right now.
He wants to change that. Chris was born in Ohio to parents from Hong Kong. He went to Duke University, then to law school. Today at 33, he's an intellectual property lawyer in Washington, D.C., shooting for partner in a firm where few Asians have broken what he calls the bamboo ceiling.
I think a lot of Asian Americans have that problem with being viewed as not true leaders.
Chris has already overcome that stereotype. He's president of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association in Washington, and he's a commissioner in the mayor's office on Asian and Pacific Islander affairs.
Part of it is, one, being at the table. The other is adding another viewpoint, adding that cultural or diverse viewpoint.
He believes Asian Americans are on the rise in U.S. politics.
My parents and my parents' generation weren't really as involved in just civics. It was more focused on how do we get our children educated, how do we get our children to be doctors, lawyers, or whatever they want to be.
But he says Asian